We are going to go ahead and get started with our work session. Today, Tuesday, November 8th. We're glad that you're all here. Thank you for being here. And we will talk tonight in our work session about short-term rentals as a follow-up discussion. This after an ordinance that was passed months ago, and a lot of thought and input at that time was given as well. And so we will now continue this discussion, this follow-up discussion, and I'll turn the time over to Mr. Astorga.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. If we could pull up the presentation, that would certainly help us out. There we go, and now we're up and running here. So I would like to start off just by giving some dates in that this process was started as a follow-up discussion based on the adoption of the amendments to the accessory dwelling unit code that took place on October 26th of 2021. That was that was done based on specific requirements that we had to meet for HB, I'm forgetting the number already, 82, I believe it's what it was. And that charge that we received from the City Council was to, in essence, solve the short-term rental issue, which was Bountiful City didn't allow them, Bountiful City didn't prohibit them. We would not issue a business license, and at the same time, there was no enforcement against them. So we had a meeting with the Planning Commission in March. I'm sorry, I do believe that we may have talked about this briefly during the January council retreat, where it was just a quick update of what we were doing. Then officially, we had the Planning Commission take a look at this proposed ordinance that staff wrote, and that took place on March 15th of 2022, where a public hearing was held. Then on March 22nd of 2022, City Council held a work session. A follow-up work session was then taking place on April 12th, 2022, and then Council adopted the short-term rental ordinance in April 26th of 2022. Even though these 4 line items are just simple line items, there was substantial deliberation and debate, not just with the City Council, but also with the Planning Commission. I think you're all there. You were all there. Cecily was part, I believe, of the Planning Commission public hearing. I think you were there too. So from that point on, the Planning Department has entertained a total of, actually there's 4 short-term rentals. 2 of them were approved on August 22nd, and the Morataya short-term rental was approved on September 26th of 2022. There is 1 that's currently on hold. So far, since we approved the code in April, we received 4 applications, of which the Administrative Committee has approved 3. Moving on to the next item here. The definition of owner-occupied was indeed challenged. It was challenged at the public hearing that the Administrative Committee, at the public hearing that the Administrative Committee during that public input comment that was challenged by the public. And I don't want to repeat the entire staff report on this presentation. You all received a copy of the Morataya short-term rental and the timeline of events that took place. Those are found on pages 3 and 4 of, 3 and 4 of the staff report, where we have a summary, and then we have a more specific timeline summary on your packets on page 5 and 6. So during this thought process, I got ahead of myself, didn't realize that. During the adoption of the code, a big worry or concern or even goal of the city council was to have that owner-occupied requirement. If you recall, at one point, we were looking at short-term rental of the entire house without having that owner-occupied requirement. At one point, we were looking at having a landlord being, no, I'm sorry, not a landlord, but a responsible manager being available within X number of miles should there was an issue. That was certainly considered by council. Ultimately, that was not what was approved. What was approved in those discussions was the beauty of the principle of being an owner-occupied requirement that was already a requirement for an accessory dwelling unit. The purpose of that is to have somebody that was present, that was on-site, that had more than just a financial investment in the neighborhood and also in the property. When we adopted the code, we didn't provide that specificity that defined what an owner-occupied was. We didn't further define it. And that's why in the Morataia application process, we first looked at it, and that was an LLC. Eventually, I should say, it became an LLC. And our first interpretation was that they were okay until we received additional research that was done by our city attorney. This is the code from the accessory dwelling unit. The property owner must occupy either the principal unit or the accessory dwelling unit as their permanent residence and at no time receive rent for the owner-occupied unit. So this was the information that we had to base our decision from. As indicated, that the current interpretation of owner-occupied currently makes LLCs and trusts not being eligible from being owner-occupied. At this point, I would turn any further questions to Mr. Clint Drake. He could expand, as we have a memo that was written from our city attorney, and he could further expand on trust. Clint, would you like to do that? Is that necessary, Mayor, to further expand on why we find that
I was gonna
trusts are
say,
not
do
eligible?
they even, does the council even want that?
Yes,
And that's why I'm
yes,
phrasing
please.
it.
I mean, we can go into the details, but in a nutshell, an LLC is a separate legal entity, and so is a trust. And so, although they are used for different purposes and are created in different ways, they have it's the same principle. They are the same as a person. It's a separate legal entity, and so in the case of an LLC or a corporation, it is the corporation that owns the property. Same thing with the trust. That's the whole point of a trust, is you transfer the property into the trust, which is then the owner of the property. So same principles. A little bit different reasons why, or some maybe even very different reasons why they might utilize those two different entities, but based on all the research that I've looked at, it appears to be the same.
So
Thank you.
So our original recommendation that we received from staff as a member of the administrative committee was to approve it. We were then challenged through the public process. We decided to continue the item, and then the interpretation for LLCs, which is the very similar, in fact, the same for trust, came through that we weren't able to provide, they weren't able to provide that positive recommendation. And then during the 11th hour, I should say, the site was deeded over to, as some codes indicate, as a natural man, not an entity as far as a trust or a LLC. So that's where we're currently at with it, in that based on our language of simply as it reads owner occupied, with the interpretation provided by the city attorney, we cannot accept an LLC or a trust as being eligible to have an ADU, and therefore they cannot have a short-term rental. So there's the first question that we need from council. Is the council comfortable with that current code and that current interpretation? That's the first question that we have.
Meaning the LLCs can't be,
Correct. LLCs and trusts.
I am.
I do not feel comfortable with the trust interpretation on this. And this is something that we could remedy by, if others on the council felt like it was appropriate to allow those who own a trust or have their home in a trust to be able to apply to get a permit for an STR. And I do think they're different. The case that was cited in the memorandum deals specifically with LLCs, and I do believe that they are different beasts. The LLC, or a trust, entails a transfer of property for a specific beneficial use of the trustor, who is more often than not the owner-occupied person in the home. And if we were to find case law or that supported something like the LLC interpretation, I think that would be a little more convincing. But I know other municipalities have dealt with the language of what is owner occupancy. And I would suggest that we consider, not tonight, but we consider as a council at a future date, the definition that we want to have for owner occupancy. Otherwise, I think if we don't put parameters around it, and then I think we're going to end up with situations like the one surrounding the property that is in question tonight, but it will just be a different workaround. So I would ask the council if we could please consider, and maybe the Planning Commission and the Planning Department could maybe come back with some possible language about trusts. For instance, in Provo, they allow in the owner occupancy language that an owner occupied allows for those who have a trust for estate planning purposes, but the trustor occupies the home and allows them to participate in this space. So, and also owner-occupier, another owner-occupier a definition that is in some cities is that the owner-occupier must own a 50% interest in the property. So, individual interest in the property. So I would like to see us kind of revisit the owner-occupied language and give some more specificity to it.
Thank you. So I think that it's clear that when we said owner occupancy, that's the key originally months ago, that we didn't realize that it would be more complex than it was when, our intent was when we were first putting that out as a criteria. So first of all, just to clarify, tonight, what we are doing is we are discussing if we want to revisit this ordinance. We will not be making any decisions tonight. We will not be voting on any changes tonight. And so I know that many of you have input you'd like to provide, and there is a period for public comment period, and I know that it may not be enough for all of you to speak, but tonight we will not be voting or making decisions on any of these things, so you still have plenty of time to email us, call us with your input about the decisions that may be made in the future. So, but in terms of, is there an appetite for the council to want to revisit the definition of owner occupancy? What does the rest of the council think?
Well, there's no question that there was some unforeseen experiences in this case, and that this particular person went to great lengths that was extraordinary to try to comply. I do think that we need to, I'm torn because I think there's some great protections for a homeowner to put their home in a trust for their beneficiaries, and force them to choose between having their home in a trust and being able to have an ADU seems, if there's a way to avoid doing that and allow a homeowner to accomplish both, I think I would like to explore that as an option. I'm not an attorney. Apparently there's a lot of legal parameters that are affecting this that are way beyond my expertise, and we'll rely on our legal experts to help us navigate those waters. But I'd love to find a way that allows somebody to have their home in a trust and still have an ADU.
An STR?
STR both.
Thank you. What do other council members think? Do you want to explore this?
I do like the language that's in the Provo code. If my parents lived in their home 50 years and were still there, and yet they had put their home in a trust for estate planning purposes, as Councilmember Price Hewish had said, and still planned to be there, I don't know why they wouldn't fulfill the spirit of that code, at least, that they would be on site. They would have long-term roots and relationships in the neighborhood, and that would cause them to make sure that their STR was not an issue. So I think we can expand it without necessarily expanding what the original intent or purpose was.
Francisco has the language that you're referring to on the board there behind you, in case for the public and for you, council, to see in particular. This is what is from the Provo Code, and you're referring to, and maybe, if I may, maybe I can have Clint just explain in a little detail what that second part in particular means, because we made sure before we came to the meeting that we knew what it meant and how we would interpret it as staff if this were adopted in our code.
So it's probably helpful for all, I'm just going to read it to start. So as used in subsection, in this subsection, owner occupancy means, and I'm going to skip to 2, a family trust created for the primary purpose of estate planning by one or more trustors who create the trust, place the dwelling in such trust, and whose primary residence is such dwelling. So there's a couple of things to note here, and one of them I would say is just, I know we've moved on from a negative experience that we might have had with this, but in this case, you might run into the same issue as what I'm saying is you could still, anybody can create a trust, and anybody can list a trustor or a beneficiary, whoever they want as the trustor, whoever they want as the beneficiary. So that's a potential issue that you've got is just like the LLC, there's a potential for some pitfalls there. Will everybody do that? Probably not. I think as you've talked about, it seems like it was some extraordinary measures that were taken to get to where they wanted to go, but that is potentially one of the issues that adopting something like this creates. There's a lot of language in there that is even, we didn't talk about this part, but I meant to talk about it earlier, just even, I don't know what a family trust is. I don't even know if you can define what a family is anymore. There's a lot of things that are being redefined right now or defined differently than they traditionally have been, and it doesn't stop anybody from just naming it this such and such family trust. It will require some effort on our part some serious investigation to do that. So I'm just noting that there are some potential pitfalls with that are similar to the corporate or LLC structure that we might run into the very same thing. And I can't remember what else. Was there something else?
Who creates? Is this limited
Yeah,
to people?
one question I had, Counselor, is that first line is a little bit worrisome. for the primary purpose of estate planning, what kind of investigation is going to
Right.
need to take
How do you
place
determine
to
that?
determine if that
Right.
was the primary motive?
Right. And a family trust created for the primary purpose of estate planning by one or more trustors who create the trust, place the dwelling in such a trust, and whose primary residence is such a dwelling. I'm going blank here, so if you're remembering better than I am right now, Gary.
Oh, well, one question was, it seemed to me that the interpretation of this is what we were talking about, was that this could only, you can have multiple trustees, and so you could make kids or cousins or, anybody a trustee. This seems to limit it to the individuals that created the trust, which would essentially be the original owners of the property.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. Sorry, I was having it was blank there. But, and again, just to talk about that issue, anybody who is the property owner can be the creator of the trust.
And any, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
But am I right in also understanding that anyone with their will or whatnot can put their home in a trust upon their death? So it's not like, so the home can still be available for a trust even after the person has passed away. So say some parents live in a home for 50 years, their owners, their name is on the title,
Yes.
that's owner occupied.
Right.
Their attorney can still advise them, when you pass away, you can still put your home into a
Yeah, the
trust for your
will-
children.
The will could put it
Or-
into a trust.
So I'm inclined to simply have the language be as clean as can be and just simply be owner is someone, your name is on the title and you are living in the home. And if that doesn't preclude anyone from putting their home in a trust for their descendants or beneficiaries later down the road,
Right.
but that does keep the integrity of the owner-occupied STR ordinance.
It does to the same extent that what we have right now does too with, say, for example, the LLC.
Yeah.
It's the same amount of,
It just makes it a more clean, like, and it precludes LLCs and trusts and anything. It's just simply, the definition of owner is your name is on the title and you are living in the home. That's what I'm,
yeah, it's limited to only the people whose name is on the title.
Not including LLCs or trusts.
exactly.
Right. That's the part of
That's
the
the current
natural person.
Which is
interpretation.
what I'm personally comfortable
Right.
with.
Right.
Do we
Right.
have an idea of how many trusts are in Bountiful? Their properties are in a trust?
I know it's substantial. I mean, it could be 10%, it could be 30%, I don't know.
Right, it's substantial.
There are more trusts than we have than we have LLCs.
For sure. I mean, it could be 50%. I doubt it, but it's definitely substantial. It's dozens, if not hundreds, or maybe thousands of properties.
So I'm inclined to still recommend that our planning commission take a look at this and review the language here, this potential Provo language, because I think there's still a unique difference between a trust, which has a beneficial use to the trustor, AKA owner, and is the de facto ownership of the trustor is the property. The fee title is often not even transferred at the point of creation of the trust. It's still in the name of the owners. And I do think it's different. One is a beneficial use versus a commercial use. And I'd love to see what our planning commission might
So-
consider about this and bring it back
So
to council.
what's your opinion about referring to planning commission? My inclination is that this is something the council could work through, and that we've already kind of been back and forth for several months. But what do other council members think on this point?
I'm inclined to keep it here and not burden the planning commission with another review.
And I could keep it here too. I mean, that's fine
If we're going to amend our zoning ordinance, it's required to go through the planning commission.
I'd rather it go to the planning commission.
That's
Thank you
fine.
for keeping
But that
it
is to say, I mean, you could direct them after you've come up with the language. You don't have to send it to
Right.
them for a recommendation first and then consider it and then
Right.
send it back. You guys can decide now, or not this second, but you could decide how you want the language to read. Then they could just it could simply be held there with a public
Public
hearing
hearing.
and then forwarded to you for final action.
Yeah, so example, you could give us direction today on what you want to see. We bring it back, we draft something, we bring it back, we make whatever changes, if any, are done, and then you send it to the planning commission and say, this is what we like, do you see any issues with it?
Okay,
Mayor,
yes.
Mr. Hill has a printout of the comments that Councilmember Bradshaw emailed today.
Okay,
Would it be appropriate to include her comments earlier on in this discussion?
sure. What I'd like to do is talk about this idea of owner occupancy, and if there's an interest in the council in changing what we have there. Do you know if Councilwoman Bradshaw discusses that point?
She does.
Okay. Yeah, let's hear her comments.
Okay, and so she addresses 3 points, and I probably can just read up to where she sort of ends her discussion about that point of ownership. And then when you want, I can read the rest of her letter. Does that seem reasonable to everybody?
Great.
Okay, and, for the record, I didn't have here today, but, she's not able to be here tonight, and so she may be here at the regular meeting and she's hopefully listening during the work session. Hope everything's okay there. Okay, I'll put on my best Kate Bradshaw impersonation. Dear City Council colleagues, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person tonight, but I'm listening in via Zoom. As I thought about the topic of our work session this evening and reviewed the information in our staff report, I wanted to provide my thoughts to you since our online attendance policy doesn't allow me to provide verbal comments during a work session. I would appreciate it if you would advise the meeting attendees that I'm attending remotely and share my written comments at the appropriate time. While tonight's topic is inspired by the ADU and STR applications at 211 North, 800 East, I would suggest that our discussion ought to be centered on the policy and administrative questions that are overarching and applicable citywide. First, I would say a word about the property and issues that have led to tonight's discussion. I'm amazed at the extraordinary lengths various parties undertook to achieve compliance with our STR ordinance. The way they operated the property and then acted when required to come into compliance came at the expense of the goodwill of their neighbors and the social connections within the neighborhood. I hope the property owners put forth efforts to repair the goodwill within the neighborhood they and their tenants' conduct damaged and to operate their STR in a way that demonstrates a desire to be both a good neighbor and a good landlord host. So, too, I hope the neighborhood will consider that the property is now a legally compliant STR and work to communicate with the owner if there are further issues related to his operation of the STR that can be addressed in a neighborly way. Government solutions are often a harder path to a resolution than a chat between neighbors over the fence. An examination of the final application seems to me to indicate a compliant application was finally achieved, though I believe it revealed multiple places where our STR policy and its application could be improved. I believe the topics that need policy discussion are as follows. First, property ownership and the council's legislative intent related to ownership. Second, code enforcement and what should be expected in terms of the city staff's response to code enforcement complaints regarding a variety of STR-related issues. And third, existing STR permit license and future renewals if there has been a history of poor ordinance adherence by the landlord. So then I will just read the first section that she states here. First would be the question of property ownership. When we adopted the STR ordinance and the requirement that STRs be restricted to legal accessory dwelling units, I was persuaded that having the property owner on site would be a significant mitigating factor that would ensure any negative impacts related to the STR that were rare and could be dealt with quickly before becoming a larger issue requiring city engagement. To me, the key to the issue of ownership is that the owners are first directly on site and that the property is their primary residence. And second, The owners are directly and immediately empowered to take any necessary actions related to their tenants. My legislative intent was in the strictest and most traditional sense of residential home ownership. The reason for this was because of the importance I placed on items 1 and 2 above, and because I thought it would be a limiting factor to the growth of ADUs, STRs in our residential zones. I don't think commercial uses like STRs should be prevalent in residential zones. Properties held in a trust or an LLC run the risk of having a person on site that is not directly and immediately empowered to take any necessary actions related to their tenant, as they might have to consult with other members of the LLC or trust before acting. I also think this will mean the property is treated like a commercial asset rather than a primary home, and that distinction is important to the social contract that holds neighborhoods together. Based on our city attorney's legal research, due to the ownership questions at 211 North, 800 East, I am comfortable that trusts and LLCs would not be able to meet the ownership standards to allow an ADU or LLC or STR, and am not inclined to revisit or broaden the definition of ownership.
Thank you. So Councilwoman Bradshaw is not interested in revisiting the question of the, definition of owner occupancy ownership. So, but it sounds like there is an appetite here on the council to look at trusts. Okay, Councilwoman Segura Bar is not interested in pursuing that. What about the rest of you?
I am interested in pursuing it because I think it will give additional parameters to, as Councilmember Bradshaw so eloquently states, around the preserving the neighborhood integrity and of the neighborhoodliness of, where STRs and ADUs are located. And I would suggest that the language be global for both, or considered for the ADU and the STR, since the obtaining an STR is contingent on getting a properly permitted ADU, which is very important. I personally believe that it doesn't necessarily broaden the definition, rather than gives guidance and parameters and, protects everybody in question, and also allows for those legitimate homeowners, owner-occupied homeowners to participate in this space in a legally complying way. And unfortunately, I understand that that has not been the experience of many people here tonight in this specific instance. But I feel like in this case, looking at this language and giving, further clarifying language and definition will help, protect all parties and allow for this use to continue in legally conforming ways.
Thank you. Do you mind putting back the language up about the trust where we were? Okay, is,
The Provo language?
Yeah, that's different.
yes.
Oh, sorry. That was
so-
another one that I had.
So Councilman Bell and Higginson, are you interested in pursuing?
Well, given our city attorney's interpretation that the trust is similar to we have similar problems and complexities with the trust as we do LLCs, gives me caution in exploring that. I feel like there's other things that we could do to help mitigate, protect our neighborhoods, and help make this a better experience that maybe we could do before doing that. I would say that I would like to look at enforcement, the permitting process or the re-permitting process, the renewal of that. How we handle complaints in a transparent way. For me, I feel like those are as much an issue as the trust language itself. And if we don't need to modify the language of trust and LLC and all that, I'm great with that. But I think that there's some larger issues that we can do to help in this matter first.
Could we, legally speaking, Clint, could the language be, owner is, your name is on the title and you're living in the home, but if you also have a trust, like, so if you have a trust, that's fine, if that's already existing, but for it to be an STR, you also have to have your name on the title and you are currently living in the home. Could those be two qualifiers for an STU?
You mean,
Or
their-
STR,
you mean their
excuse me.
name would be on the title before it's transferred into a trust?
Correct.
Yeah,
But they are still residents of the home. So they couldn't have a trust, and the home couldn't just be in the trust, and the trust, not the trustees. What's the title or the phrase for the person that creates the trust?
so there's
Trustor.
there's a, grantor is the one that I usually use.
Grantor.
And
So, sorry, I'm thinking of this on the fly. Like I said, I'm not inclined to revisit the language. I like Councilwoman Bradshaw, I'm okay with as is. But is there a way to protect neighbors as well as people who already have their estate planned in such a way, but they are still living in the home? But to make it so they are living in the home, I don't know if I'm making sense,
you are.
that they're living in the home, but if they want an STR, that is okay. But it disqualifies people who just create a trust and treat it as a business enterprise.
I,
Or is that too in the weeds?
yeah, I don't know, because it would be difficult, yeah.
That's how it would be used. People would find loopholes. And that's what I think, to Councilman
Could you have
To
a
be
Bell's,
clear,
waiting
what
period?
Councilmember Price Hewish
20
is saying, I totally agree with it, that there are two totally different reasons. One is commercial, one is not. But I'm not aware of anything that prohibits anybody that owns a piece of property from putting it into a trust. For whatever reason, whether they want to say it's commercial or not. And there's nothing in a trust that says it has to be, that your beneficiaries have to be a family member.
which is
so-
fine,
Right.
yeah.
But it just, what I'm getting at is that it is my opinion that a motivated person may find ways around that.
And because of that, I am inclined to keep it as clean as possible and just simply owner occupied is your name is on the title and you are living in the home. So essentially leave the language as is. And that was my original intent when I voted for it as owner occupied.
Yeah, and even that, some people might be so motivated as to even do that. But yes, that is the ultimate restriction. And I think no matter what we do, there's probably an exception to every single rule that we could ever
Yeah,
come
there's
up
always
with.
going to be
But that does provide a lot of, that is the most restrictive.
Thank you.
Could I make a comment, Mayor?
Sure.
So I feel like in the instance of the 800 East property, what we're looking at is a situation where somebody does have an ownership interest. That ownership interest is not defined as to percentages or what type of an ownership interest it is, and it's just very vague. So I feel like unless we define this, more vagaries will come forward, and I really don't like that, which is why I think this natural person who possesses 50% or more of the ownership, as to subset I and subset II. The thing that I think is concerning, if we do not allow the family trust, or we don't have to call it a family trust, it could be a trust for estate planning, for, you know, the trustor or grantor to be, who is a owner occupied to live there and have this, is we don't have the numbers, but we will be shutting out a significant number of people in Bountiful who are, and I think there could be implications that we will come to bear, I don't know, about whether or not those individuals are going to be allowed to have an ADU and ergo an STU, an STR. I think we're talking about maybe two different things. One is, how are we going to define this owner occupancy, and what does that mean? I think more clarifying language here would be helpful, because we don't know what, in this case, again, I'll refer to the case at hand that so many people are here for tonight, we don't know what that interest looks like.
We do now.
Well,
We do.
so I couldn't find it in the application. Is it I mean, they have a 100% interest, a 50%
I'm sorry, I thought you were saying we
interest?
didn't know what our interpretation of owner occupied is.
No, of.
I apologize.
Of what,
No, our
of
code
the
is silent
800
on
East
what percentage,
property.
you're right, what percentage of,
right.
an
so-
owner is, we don't define an owner, it has to have at least X percentage, you're
So
correct.
then that could be split up into ever increasingly smaller portions of ownership, and, which is concerning. So to me, I think the ownership interest language would give guidance, and also allow so many people who will be and are conforming to the codes and the ordinance and the requirements in the ADU space and the STR space to participate in that. I think the other issue that is really concerning here, and I will only touch on this because I know we're going to talk about it more, is the compliance issue. And the compliance to certain processes, procedures, knowing that we have a procedural process by which everybody, now we do have, and I printed it to bring it tonight, I have the ADU application and the STR application that's online. Those are procedurally, you know, we know what to expect there because we have the applications. But I think what would give people a larger degree of confidence on the compliance front would be to know that we have certain processes and procedures that with anticipated timelines for reporting, for violations, and for, so people can anticipate when investigations would take place, under what circumstances, and I tried to look to see how I would file a complaint if I needed to do this, and it's an email address, and I think that we can beef up these procedures and these processes to give people a greater level of assurance. I do not suggest in any way that our planning department is not looking into complaints or, reports of code violations or ordinance violations for people who have a permit. But I do believe that we can do better by formalizing the process.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to this idea of ownership before we talk more about code enforcement compliance?
If I could, I'd like to just opine briefly on the ownership question. I'm okay with just going with the first single I on that for now. Kind of give this a beat of time as we focus on our process, making sure that it's transparent for both the applicant and for concerned neighbors, making sure that we've got in place a robust enforcement policy. And as we work that out, and maybe just go with the definition of at least a 50% owner and living in the home, we can see if there is a lot of public clamor for expanding the definition of ownership or not. I don't know how many folks this affects, but I know that no one's going to be terribly put out if we take time to get our process right first, and then maybe take a look at expanding the definition of owner-occupied.
Thank you. Good suggestions. So starting with this first paragraph, defining it in this way, and then let's talk briefly about code enforcement. Do you want to read Councilwoman Bradshaw?
Before you
Yes.
move on, can I just
Sure.
make one really quick comment?
Mm-hmm.
Just to point out, we appreciate the input, and I do think that regardless of the direction, we do need to flush it out a little bit more. So doing that is great. That is much more definitive. But I will say this, and this is just meant for informational purposes. The only way to truly not have this gray area is to either completely restrict or just completely allow. Everything in between has the potential to have unintended consequences. I'm not saying it will happen, but it could. And a perfect example of that is in that paragraph 1 right there that says a natural person who possesses 50%. So in that scenario, if my parents live in Bountiful City, years go by, they pass along, I'm one of 4 children, they deed the property to us. We don't want to sell the property, but we don't want to live in it at the time, or one of us wants to live in it. We couldn't do that because we would own 25% of the property. So there's always going to be something. I mean, we can't define everything. That's just an example. I'm not saying that the percentages should change. I'm just using that as an example of there are many, probably infinite ways that, can be considered that is going to prohibit somebody at some point. But we definitely appreciate, and it is my recommendation that we do at least have a little bit more definitive definitions. So if the council on this particular issue is comfortable with that, I think then that's what we can
I think that
do.
sounds good as a starting place, to start with paragraph I, and then we can always revisit. And then if we want to talk briefly about code enforcement.
Sorry, just.
Sure.
We need to make sure that there's some consensus to bring back an ordinance that says that. I mean, right now, we've just had one person, say, let's do this, but it'd be good to get some head nods if you want us to bring back an ordinance that incorporates I.
To have a little direction, I agree with that we need to have some greater definitions and explanations of our interpretations. That, along with subsequent conversations, I'm sure we'll have more to add to that ordinance.
Okay. And Councilwoman Segura Bar, are you okay with moving in that direction?
I am okay with as written, so I would not revisit it. I'm okay with the all or nothing approach, and it simply being the owner, your name is on the title, and you are living in the home.
Okay. And Councilwoman Price Hewish, would you like to revisit, would you like to look at a starting place of having a ordinance with this included?
I would definitely like to revisit the language of what owner occupancy means. I am in favor of both I and double I, but so whatever we land on here tonight, I'm in favor of looking at both of these, because to me, the bigger problem is enforcement and processes and procedures, not necessarily the legally conforming individuals who are playing fairly in this space.
Well said.
Sounds like we don't have consensus, so I'm wondering what's your,
So, I mean, essentially, to consider an item, you only need one person to request it. And kind of what I'm hearing is there is generally interest in at least considering I.
yeah.
We'll draft something that includes that and bring it back as a draft ordinance, and then the council can choose to add to it, not consider it, or drop it entirely. But it sounds like there's more discussion wanted on the question of ownership.
Right, and more discussion in general. I'm just wondering, because we're low on time, I'm wondering if we can revisit this discussion in a few minutes as part of our regular meeting. What do you recommend?
Well, I guess I would say this. We know from staff that there's a lot of interest in, and we agree in the enforcement side of this in particular, and what the policy is. Staff's very aware. We've begun meeting on that about our code enforcement process. What I would propose is that we come back once we've had an opportunity to sort of flesh out what we think that might look like, knowing that you all have very similar concerns. I think we have a good handle on what those are, and we could have a more productive discussion then. And this would probably be based on our schedule for the rest of the year. This would probably be in the January timeframe that we would come back with a discussion about the code enforcement process. In the meantime, we would love to hear. I've talked to many of you individually, and I know some of you have talked to each other, but we would love to maybe have you just email us your thoughts about what the code enforcement ought to look like.
So ownership, owner occupancy, code enforcement, STR permitting, licensing, any other issues, council, that you feel like are an important component of this?
I think a transparent way of logging the complaints, having the landowner be able to respond to those, and a way to remove or take away that permit if there's
Well,
negligence.
transparency is an interesting question because these are investigations, and we don't talk publicly about investigations. We don't those public. So we just have to define what transparent means. So just a caveat, but I hear what you're saying, which is a clear and obvious way for people to lodge complaints and to know what process to expect, which includes feedback, and that's what am I on the right track, Jesse and Cecily?
Yes, and that the landowner is aware and has an opportunity to rectify,
Of course,
so.
yeah.
Mayor?
What other issues?
One thing I was wondering if others on the council would consider is if somebody files for or submits a permit application in the ADU or the STR with either application, if from the time that they file their application to the time where it's scheduled for an administrative hearing, if there is any change in ownership, I would recommend that if there is any change in ownership during that period of time, that there be a postponement of the administrative hearing. So we don't have a situation like arose in this case where change in ownership happened on the same day as the administrative hearing. It's just bad procedure to just, in my opinion, it's not the best practice that we could employ. And if we were to say, if there is some kind of change in ownership during that period of time, there would be a delay in review by the administrative committee, and in which time people would be able to learn more about the change in ownership, and it would give staff more time than to just, as we are always talking about, have to work on the fly around something that comes out of the blue.
So could it just simply be if there's a change of ownership, a new application needs to be submitted? The old application is null and void.
I could go for that too.
So
Can
how
I
would
add-
folks find out about the change of ownership during this delay?
Well, I think if the property changes hands, it's the property owners.
So the property owner is going to notify all the neighbors that there's been a change in the definition of their ownership.
Well, we could
I don't know how
we
that
could
information becomes
include-
public.
We could include that language on the application. And then change in ownership, they would have to report that to the city. And if they show up to the administrative hearing with a change in ownership, then that would be a ding in
But
their
if we,
ability to get the STR.
And but then if we simply also have ownership occupied means your name is on the title and you are living in the home, then that alleviates a lot of these administrative headaches.
However, in the case, this STR that we're talking about tonight, it is legally not, it was permitted legally because of the ownership interest
But
that
it
was
wasn't
granted to
occupied.
Mr. Montoya?
Morataya.
Morataya.
But through an LLC, and then that's not compliant.
Right, but on the day of the administrative hearing,
on the day of the hearing,
there was a quitclaim deed. If I'm recalling this correctly, there was a quitclaim deed putting him and Mr. Morataya and the LLC as property owners. So I think if we only go with property ownership, if we adopt this type of language where it has to be 50% ownership, then maybe that would help alleviate some of these problems. But right now, with property ownership, as it is, it can be, a little piece here, a little piece here, not necessarily defined. So I think if there's any change in ownership, from the time the application is submitted to the time of the administrative hearing, just in good faith, it should be remedied, maybe with a new application. I could agree with that, or with a delay in actually, probably a new application would be the most appropriate.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but that is something that the council could consider. So we will just, please submit ideas that you have or things that you would like to see in future changes. And we will be revisiting this in the upcoming months. So we will now close this meeting and take just a few minutes before we open our regular council meeting.